So one more time, everyone, welcome to our October virtual happy hour, where Dr. David Goldstein will be joining us. He's currently Energy Co-Director for the Natural Resource Defense Council. But before we get there, we'll share a little bit more about who we are as a team. So we are Solar Austin. We are made up of a few board members, and Kahiba is our president, and as well as Beryl, who is our single part-time worker. And everyone else is just, we're volunteers on the board, able to kind of spread some knowledge and be able to act as much as we can on our mission, which is essentially to accelerate the transition of clean and renewable technologies across Central Texas, so that we can create a healthier community and a stronger local economy. We were started in 2002 as a chapter of the Texas Solar Energy Society as a 501c3. So we can't make any sort of political recommendations, but we will be talking about energy policy today. And then we'll talk a little bit more about our sponsor. So our stellar sponsor is FTC Solar, a tracker company based out of Austin. And we have some new megawatt sponsors that have donated generously to support our initiatives. Mayfield Renewables is one of those. They are a design firm located throughout the nation. And one of our board members works for there if you're interested in learning more about what the world of design holds. Yada Energy is a manufacturer. They are making a battery that is underneath a solar panel, essentially. It is I don't want to get too complicated, but essentially modular batteries for solar systems. And the Recurrent Energy and Freedom Solar Powers are developers as well as solar installers. We also have some new kilowatt sponsors. Z Prime, a media company. One of our board members works for there, and Power from Partners, Brant, and then They Might Be Monkeys joined our sponsorship team. They are a tree and landscaping company that will help remove any trees for your solar systems. We also have the kilowatt sponsors of Piper Maddox, of Sunpro Energy Specialists, Lighthouse Solar, HEB, and CED Green Tech, as well as our watt sponsors of Greenbelt Solar, Clean Power Marketing Group, the Diurnal Group, and then Greener by Design and Harris Energy Solutions. So if you were interested in learning more about our sponsors, then check out our page, Solar Austin/our sponsors, or just feel free to drop us a line if you want to donate a little bit of money in exchange for advertisement space. Depending on how much you donate, then you can see how much advertising you get, in addition to perhaps being part of our emails. So kind of continuing with the last month's happy hour, the local utility in Austin Energy, has the current RFP that is sent out for proposals that want to develop a solar project no greater than 10 megawatts of solar plus storage. So the phase for questions passed, but right now they will post the answers to those questions on their website, and the formal RFP, the request for proposal, is due on November 17th. One of our biggest initiatives right now is the Pathways to Clean Energy program. As you guys might know, we had our pilot program earlier this year. It was a big success, and now we broke into our second edition of it, as we are pairing up with university students of underrepresented minorities, local solar companies, and as well as a diversity, equity, and inclusion consultant that will help facilitate pathways for these underrepresented students to enter the clean energy industry, as well as for these companies to become more diverse and become a little bit better versed as to how to be more equitable, meet people halfway as to how we can create a more representative solar sector. In addition to that, because of the interest of students that we've received, as well as other professionals, we are starting to craft a mentorship program. The goal of this mentorship program is to spread a little bit of knowledge between industry professionals and people that want to either enter the industry, learn about different parts of it, but it's just facilitating these conversations amongst our network. So if you're interested in being a mentor, please feel free to talk to Andrea. She's here with us tonight. Send her a message or drop us an email at info@solaraustin.org. This is one great way for you to just donate a couple hours of your time, talk to interested individuals, and the same goes for the individuals that want to be mentored. If you want to learn more about a specific sector of our industry, please send us a message, say, hey, I am so-and-so, I want to learn more about this or that, and we can use our networks to facilitate these conversations. It's all volunteership, and it is just another way for us to improve a stronger community out of in Austin. We also want to give a huge thank you. I don't know if you attended our last happy hour, but we were in our first drive of our Community Thrives initiative, which is sponsored by the Candidly Foundation, the same foundation that sponsors USA Today and other local newspapers such as the Austin Statesman. And we were able to win one of those bonus challenges, which was having the most donors give in a single week. So as you can tell, it was a very tight race to reach the #1 spot, but thanks to the participation of each one of you, we were able to get an additional $5,000 by the Candidly Foundation, which was amazing. And in all, we were able to meet our goal of getting 500 donors of our community to support us with $23,000 to 119. So a big thank you from us to all of you, because now we're able to kind of expand a little bit into our programs, be a more mature organization, and perhaps we'll be able to join Beryl, and we'll be able to help Beryl have another paid staff member join our team. So with that, if you didn't donate, or if you would like to give us another $1 or $2 or so, please take the moment to scan this code or enter this bit.ly, and that way we can make sure that we offer the best services you can, whether it is community solar installations, whether it is educating the neighborhood on solar, or flexing a little bit of our policy muscle. We definitely have big goals for 2021, and we want to make sure that we're well equipped to accomplish that, and keep up the pace of the growth of solar in Texas. And I don't know if Dr. Goldstein has joined yet.
I'm here. I hope you can hear me.
Excellent. Great. So I'll introduce you. Here's Dr. Goldstein, which is one of the brightest minds in energy policy in our country. He's been a passionate advocate since the 1970s, shaping a little bit of the policy side for buildings, for utilities, for the nations, as to how we can be stronger with our energy conservation efforts, as well as energy efficiency. You can stay up to date with his posts through the NRDC expert blog. The link is posted right there. He most recently wrote in September different strategies for us to accomplish net zero energy buildings. In July, he was talking more about how we can transform the industry, and he talks a little bit about COVID and climate change. So in addition to these monthly blog posts, he has written a couple books. One of them is called Saving Energy and Growing Jobs. That was in 2007. And the other one is called Invisible Energy. These are strategies to rescue the economy and save the planet, in 2009. Both of those books are available on Amazon. I definitely recommend you to check them out, find them, and support his work, because there is a wealth of different data points, different theories, different case studies presented by different countries that are useful for us to know and keep in mind as we move forward into the clean energy future. So without further ado, if David is ready, if Dr. Goldstein, you're ready to share your screen,
sure.
You're ready to lead the show, and let us know how we can support you.
Let's see, I'm having a little bit of IT issues here. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you just perfectly. It's okay. We have a little bit of time. So, and let me know if you want me to present my screen with the presentation you sent over last night.
I'm going to try share screen. And okay, can everyone see this?
Yep, I think it's working just fine.
Okay, well, when I say I'm delighted to be here at a talk, it's seldom as delighted as I am right now, because I had massive IT problems just 15 minutes ago, and I'm sitting on a different computer than the one that we had set up last night, because apparently Zoom works differently when you're in a conference with 50 people than when you are with 3 people. So it's great that it's all working. Of course, I would have been more delighted if I could have been there in person, because talks are a dialogue, not a monologue. And it's always much better when you can look at your audience in the eye and see when you're on target with something rather than not. And I really enjoyed my last trip to Austin, but you know, we do what we can. So this talk is going to be about energy policies that will get us the clean energy future that's necessary to solve climate change. Climate change is on the minds of just about everyone who has the wit to think about the problem. Climate change is not something that's happening over the hill and far away. These are not pictures that I got out of stock photos on climatechange.com, or that I had to rent an airplane to go these exotic places to see them. These are pictures that I took during my hobby activities as a photographer, and they just happened to be showing melting glaciers. That's how common they are. But let me make it really scary. This is the view from my window in San Francisco at 11 a.m. Look at the lights on the bridge and on the streets compared to the daylight, and you will see that this is right out of Blade Runner. This is what we saw due to forest fires triggered by climate change that were fully 500 miles away. This was a day without sunshine. It was like a 500th the normal brightness. So that's the pessimistic part. The optimistic part is the whole rest of the talk. We can meet the Paris goal of stabilizing climate while producing millions of jobs, reducing drastically air pollution that kills millions of people worldwide and about 50,000 in the US every year, and keeping energy service costs low for businesses and consumers in the United States. New federal policy can accelerate and complement existing efforts, which by and large have been locally or state initiated, not federally initiated. That's been a real deficiency of American energy policy on a largely bipartisan basis, going back to when the Department of Energy was established in 1977. Energy efficiency is the most important of the resources, the largest, cheapest, greenest, and fastest resource. But of course, it's not going to be able to solve the whole problem. You still need energy produced. So renewable energy is important to substitute for oil and gas and any other kinds of polluting fuels. And that's a major contribution. And there are a few minor, really not so minor contributions that I'll get to later. Efficiency and renewables need to be integrated on a real-time basis, because when you don't have a lot of efficiency, you just plug in solar and everything works great. But when you do have a lot of solar and a lot of efficiency, you need to integrate the two so that you're consuming energy when solar is producing it. And that's a doable technical task, but you have to think about it and actually do it. From a policy perspective, there is no silver bullet. There's not even silver buckshot. We need new and reformed policies on all levels: global institutions, federal US and other country institutions, state, local, utility regulator, private company, NGOs, and individual actions. And we need them now, and I'll show you why in a little bit. There are lots of synergies, and I'll get back to that, because good policies on one level can model or test drive or stimulate good policies on another level, and also because these policies naturally complement each other. If you're doing one of them, it makes the other ones easier and more effective, and they feed back on making the first one more effective. So here's my big optimistic point. The US and the world can still meet the obligations of the Paris Agreement, despite this president's statement that he will pull us out of it. And the reason for that is that pullout, if it happens, is not until next week. And the next president could rejoin the agreement if he chose to do so. Provinces and states are accelerating their efforts to cut emissions within North America. And Canada is still part of the agreement. They're a separate country, of course. The Paris Agreement calls for limiting climate change to 1.8 degrees C. You probably haven't heard the number 1.8, but what do you think well under 2 means? It doesn't mean 1.98. And then for pursuing efforts to limit climate change to 1.5 degrees. Pursue effort sounds a little fudgy, but it does not say pursue thought, and it does not say consider efforts. So it's actually a pretty strong statement that says, you've got to really try to do this. And maybe you won't quite succeed, but if you don't, you'll get a lot closer than if you didn't try. And holy moly, maybe you'll succeed because you did try, because that's been the record for the few places and times where we have tried. There are strategic goals that NRDC and others have put together for what businesses, government, religions, citizens can do to meet the goal. The best studies agree that the goals can be met in economically attractive ways, and many of them economically attractive means more attractive than business as usual, not even counting the damage from climate change. So here's what we did. First, model in detail what it takes to meet the 2-degree challenge, which was what we thought we needed to do 6 years ago, and NRDC has done that. And then second, use those model results to estimate what else is needed to come up within the stricter 1.5 degree limit. And this blog, actually set of 3 blogs, will tell you what those things are. So to achieve 2 degrees, there's 4 primary carbon reduction strategies. Deploying all cost-effective energy efficiency throughout all sectors, deploying as much renewable and zero carbon electric generation as we possibly can, and we're doing a good job of that, particularly at the state level, where a number of states have set binding 100% clean energy goals for 2045. Broad electrification of buildings, industry, and vehicles, because when you electrify, you can supply the needs by renewables, and if you don't, it's really hard or expensive or both. And furthermore, because a lot of those needs are very amenable to being complementary to renewable energy. In other words, to operate preferentially when the wind blows and the sun shines, and not so much when they don't. And then decarbonizing the remaining liquid fuel, that's not as important if we're going all the way to 1.5 degrees, because we're not going to have enough budget even left for the decarbonized fuels. Here are 6 additional policies that allow us to pretty much meet the 1.5 degree goal. So if we weren't arbitrarily limiting ourselves to 6, we could thoroughly meet it. This is a US-based analysis. I won't read these through, but fast, deep retrofit of buildings is at the top. That's really important because the scale of that is immense and the job creation potential is immense. Strategic energy management is a new way of managing businesses to encourage them to look at energy in a way that promotes continual improvement. And I'll get back to that a little bit. You notice 2 items at the bottom which don't have anything to do with energy, or at least not directly, but are really important for non-carbon. So here's what it takes to meet a 1.5 degree goal. I wish I could use my fingers here. Maybe I could use the mouse. The area under this curve is cumulative emissions. So what you can see, if this cumulative emissions gets us to 1.5, it is more important how quickly we reduce them than what we eventually reduce to. We could reduce to 10% and not 0 and maintain that for a long time if we drop this curve really quickly now. And that's where the retrofits come in, because we have worked on projects 30 and 20 years ago where we've retrofit whole towns with deep retrofits in 4 years. So this is 10 years, we can do it in 4 if we have the willpower to do it. And of course, there are challenges all the way. How do we know we can do it? Well, California is already halfway there, and I'll illustrate that in a second. The executive director of the regional planning organization in LA says LA has built its last freeway. So the city that got its reputation for the auto being king is looking at new directions based on smart growth, transit-oriented development, and a $50, I think, billion transit investment program. Countries around the world are finding that they can do much more than they thought once they make the effort, and India is the poster child for that, but China comes pretty close to that as well. India had an impossible goal of 100 gigawatts of renewable energy by next year. Then they raised it to 200, and they're just about there. US climate pollution is dropping about as fast as it would have if the 2009 climate bill had passed. To be sure, that's partly from actions that had already been taken by 2016, because there's a time lag in doing this, but it's still an important accomplishment. And then finally, the world has agreed to phase out refrigerants that cause climate change, and that's not something that had been in the climate models up till now, so it's a bonus savings. So here's California's experience in the electricity sector. California, through intentional policy, cut the growth rate of per capita electricity to 0 in 1975, and it stayed that way ever since, while the rest of the country grew about 40%. You'll fortunately see around here the rest of the country is beginning to catch up. So that's an encouraging sign about how good state and local examples, and Austin has lots of opportunities, some of which you've realized, to be that local example. So here's our suite of policies that will get you to climate goals. They fall into these broad general categories that I'm going to describe next. The first one, not the most important one, but a symbolically important one, is setting an emissions cap. That's important because as much as you hear blather about free markets, and free markets are great where they work, businesses set goals. They don't maximize profits directly. They say, our sales goal for next year is this. Our cost reduction goal for next year is that. And a goal on carbon reduction will motivate all of the actors, businesses, local governments, to say, oh, we've got to live within this carbon constraint. I guess we're going to do A rather than B. States with a cap, such as California, which had the world's first economy-wide cap, do not rely primarily on the end trade part of cap and trade to meet their goal. 85%, and maybe it's even more than that now, of the goal is met by the kind of policies I'm going to talk about next. Corporations can do this. In the absence of federal leadership, a number of companies have committed to zero carbon. So this little pyramid represents how you deal with most of the devices that consume energy, whether they're automobiles, homes, commercial buildings, churches, refrigerators, whatever. The structure of a pyramid is that the height of the pyramid is the level of advancement of the technology. And the breadth of the pyramid is how many people are doing it. So the base at the bottom of the pyramid is mandatory standards. There's some things that are just so cost effective, it's not worth the trouble of worrying about how you get it done. Just do it. You know, these things are so beneficial and become more so when everyone does it. Normative labels are things like Energy Star or Good Housekeeping Seal of Approval. It's something that you ought to do. A lot of people will buy the more efficient product just because it's got a star on it. So that works for widely available products that don't cost a lot more. Informative labels give you the energy consumption, because up until a couple years ago, you could invest in a 1 million square foot commercial office building in New York City, and 20% of its net operating income goes to pay the utility bills, but you had no idea whether your particular building is 10%, 20%, or 40%. They've solved that problem through disclosure ordinances. Managed incentives are what utilities do to promote efficiency. They will manage to a budget. They will encourage people to buy the more efficient product when it does have an extra cost, and that would otherwise be a barrier to people doing it. Market transformation is a way of coordinating utility incentives so that they can ask for things that maybe aren't really available. But if everyone in the country or the continent is asking for these throughout the utility sector, then manufacturers will respond by producing this. Long-term incentives include things like tax incentives that we've had recently, and R&D to fill the technology pipeline with new technologies or design methods. The key thing about this graph is the poorly drawn arrows on the right, because everything you do at a higher level trickles down to the lower level because you've demonstrated the feasibility. You can do managed incentives for something where markets have been transformed enough that you're not promising your customers as a utility, I'll pay you to do something. Oh, haha, you can't do it. You can't find it. And similarly, the experience with Energy Star often shows whether a standard at that level might be feasible or not. Things that a city can do on this include adopting local building codes. There's the IECC as a model of moderate levels of efficiency. There's ASHRAE 90.2 as a model for advanced levels of efficiency if you want to demonstrate leadership and coordinate with informative labeling, because that standard requires a compliance method that automatically produces the informative label. So why shouldn't the builder just share it with his customers? All of these require key performance indicators or metrics for efficiency, and that's one of the advantages of having the standards, is everything else can go to work on the metrics that the standards has already developed. Retrofits are important, I mentioned, because of cumulative emissions. Buildings account for 35% emissions, so you can't get to the levels I showed you in that graph unless you do something about them. And we already know how to get savings of about 30% in energy and a bigger percent in emissions, particularly if we electrify buildings with heat pumps. The cost is large. That 4 trillion includes commercial buildings, but it's well within the capability of the private sector. How do we know? Because that's the level they were investing in 2006 before the new construction market collapsed. That's how much we were financing. That's how much we were building in dollar terms. So it's just a matter of retraining the same people who were doing this work 15 years ago to do it again. These are well-paying, generally, blue-collar jobs, don't require a college education. Local demonstrations can help because we do not have large-scale models for how to retrofit every home and every office building and every shopping center over the next 10 years. Policies for the industrial sector. This pyramid works for some kind of mass-produced equipment, for example, swimming pool pumps and air circulating fans, both of which we did through DOE with the active consent and support of the associated industry. Strategic energy management calls for the businesses that agree to do it to come up with an energy plan that will meet established goals for continual improvement. Why is this important? Here's kind of a conceptual dashboard for what a plant manager would see when he or she walks into the office on a Monday morning. Production is what you're really doing, and everything else around it is a constraint. Cost is a constraint. Energy is 5% of cost. Really, how much priority are you going to give to energy? Hardly any at all. So what a standard that you've committed to does is it makes energy the equivalent of a regulation. You've got your CEO promising that we have an energy policy that's going to do all this. Guys, better get with the program and do it. Transportation sector is important, as we've made dramatic progress in the building sector over the past 40 years, at least in the states and cities that are working hard at it. Transportation has emerged as the largest greenhouse gas polluter. And you hear a lot about electric cars. Those can be encouraged through this pyramid structure that we discussed. But we can also get people to drive less. And that's important because you can do that immediately. We did that this year, not intentionally, but because there was no place to drive to that you want to go to in the middle of COVID shutdowns. And we can do this relatively quickly by trying to integrate ride-sharing programs, once ride-sharing is safe enough, with mass transit, and by designing and retrofitting neighborhoods so that they are pedestrian-friendly, bike-friendly, and have local serving businesses, which incidentally is also more jobs available. Those transit-friendly, walking-friendly neighborhoods, such as the one I live in, have less than 1/4 the amount of driving, even controlling for income, as typical suburban sprawl. And property values are higher, and their loans performed a lot better during the mortgage meltdown of 12 years ago. So what we've done in California is set goals for automobile travel reductions through transit-oriented development. These have been adopted voluntarily. Well, they were required, but the requirement is not really enforceable by metropolitan planning organizations. That's one of the reasons for the quote from the one from LA. And you've seen a radical change from detached single-family large lot dwellings, which people of the millennial generation don't generally prefer when they have a choice anyway, to more compact single-family and multifamily dwellings in neighborhoods that are more fun to be in, as well as allowing people to drive far less. And by the way, reducing costs, because the costs of driving are almost as big as the costs of housing on a national average level. So being able to cut them by 3/4 has allowed, for example, me to go on all these exotic vacations that I'm not sure I would have been able to afford if I was supporting the typical 2.5 cars. Increasing transport options, this includes both local transit and high-speed rail on a national level. Oh, but how could you do high-speed rail in a country that's spread out as the United States? Answer, because the United States is almost exactly as spread out as the European Union. Same population, same area, more or less. And all of the major countries in the EU have very successful high-speed options that compete favorably with airlines, particularly in terms of reliability. And I've traveled enough to say that from firsthand experience compared to airlines, and they're just more comfortable. And then we can use financial incentives. We can price car insurance, parking, which is usually given away for free, and roadways based on use. Ever wonder why traffic is so congested at rush hour? Simple economic theory says if you give something away for free, it'll be oversubscribed. So pricing is a demonstrated strategy of eliminating traffic jams, in addition to whatever carbon benefits it may be providing, and also of allowing you to pursue really important trips without people getting in your way if you're just willing to pay for them that one time. Renewable energy policies, the most effective thing in my observation has been renewable portfolio standards that require a given percentage of generation that utilities sell to come from renewables. This is great because it works complementarily with electrification, because it guarantees, if you're in California where our RPS is, I think, 60% for 2030, that if you buy an electric car, 60% of the electricity is coming from renewables and the other 40 from very high efficiency natural gas. So that is way, way better on carbon pollution than combustion automobiles. Similarly for heat pumps versus gas furnaces, heat pump water heaters versus gas water heaters. Demand flexibility to integrate variable renewables into the grid. If you've got a water heater, there is no need to charge it after the sun goes down because it's got a storage tank. You can charge it when there's excess sunshine in the morning that you don't otherwise know what to do with. You could build houses so they can store up cooling and pre-cool in the morning hours when there's plenty of solar so that you're well positioned for 8 o'clock when there isn't a lot of it. Similarly with wind. So that I think is an area of increasing importance in the future in all sectors, is how can you control demand that keeps the customer satisfied and allows us to integrate more and more renewables, eventually 100%, into electric grids. Incentives for rooftop solar, because in California, at least, rooftop solar doesn't even count towards the RPS. So that means everything we can put on a rooftop is additional solar generation beyond what the utility is procuring for us. So that's a way to improve the use of renewables. The duck curve. I don't know how many of you have heard of the duck curve. This is the shape of the load curve which really looks like this. When someone first realized that it was a prospect in the future in 2012, you can see over here. And things have pretty much followed the predicted pattern. There's not much load when the sun shines, and you have this huge ramp up in the evening. So that's an increasingly important problem that we are learning to solve, and it would help us if we could learn even faster. And that is reflected in greenhouse gas emissions. If you produce solar when the sun's shining, particularly other than the summer, you're not saving as much emissions as you would have hoped. And if you consume in the evening, you're really causing trouble. So again, we need this demand flexibility to make the solar more productive at reducing emissions as we get more and more of it each year, which we need to do in any event. Seasonal variation just exacerbates this. Here's a graph for existing grid in California and projected grid. The point of this is just that there are green hours and there are red hours, and you want to conserve as much as you can in the red hours, and you do that even at the expense of pushing consumption into the green hours where most of the generation is clean to begin with. So here's where we are now, and step by step, you work through demand response, that's automated demand response, efficiency, and load changing. And all of those can teach the duck to fly by giving us the dark green curve rather than the original curve. And I apologize for the non-original graphic, but I thought it was cute. Agricultural policies are important. I don't know much about them, but forest preservation and expansion is really important, meaning what's happening in places like Brazil needs to be stopped. They're not the only ones. There are problems worldwide driven by unsustainable agriculture, in my non-expert observation. Managing soil carbon is a very complicated scientific issue, but the point is we can do a lot better with it. Reducing meat consumption, particularly beef. This is a methane issue primarily, not a carbon issue. It's also a little bit of deforestation issue. And it's important because I cannot imagine in a free country anyone telling you you've got to eat less meat. I can imagine responsible individuals choosing on their own to eat less beef and encouraging their friends to do so, recognizing that the perfect should not be the enemy of the good. And we're not saying everyone needs to go vegetarian entirely, but we're just saying maybe you could reduce beef consumption a little bit. Conservation will also save energy and emissions. And I used to really distinguish between conservation, which means accepting a reduction in quality of energy service, and efficiency, which means providing the same energy service or better at simply less energy use. That becomes blurred, particularly in the business sector, because turning off lights at home is just one more damn thing you have to remember to do. But in a business, it's a job somebody does. It's employment. That's part of what business does. Some companies have had a stellar record of cutting back on energy use through better operations and maintenance, year upon year improvements of 4% or more over decades. So we can go farther with conservation than most people thought, and the most people I refer to are the ones who do the scenarios about how we're going to meet Paris. We can also ask individual choice questions. What level of energy services do we need? How big a house do we need to be satisfied? I live in 1,100 square feet and raised 2 teenagers through that. Does primary reliance on transit improve or degrade your quality of life? Should parking be free? Because parking at the levels that we think it's out there, 8 spaces per car, think about that. What are parking spaces made of? Asphalt and concrete, very emissions intensive materials. You could cut the equivalent of 15, 20, I forget the number, % of gasoline use equivalent of emissions by bringing that parking space number down to 1, which is all you need if everyone did shared mobility, even if they didn't share the ride with anyone else. Conservation and efficiency are an interesting trade-off because unexpected things happen, and sometimes they produce power shortages. And if you've already done all the conservation you can and something bad happens, you don't have any reserve left. You don't have any fat that you can trim. Structural policies are important. These are not federal policies for the most part, but the feds can encourage them at the state level. Reform utility regulation to align customer benefit with utility profit. A lot of utilities in the country will lose money if you invest in efficiency, will lose money if you invest in solar, so they'll try to stop you from doing it. And they did that over the years through opposition to energy codes and making it really difficult to hook up solar systems in states where you wouldn't think that would be the case. But we know how to solve that. We know how to align customer benefit with investor profit. In your case, for a municipal utility, that's easier to do because the investors are you. And then broadly, infrastructure can support all of these policies. Training, education, financial reforms, such as allowing energy efficiency to be financed based on the outcome in terms of lower bills. So in other words, you can afford an energy efficient home more than you can an inefficient one, even though it might cost a little bit more. How come the banks won't lend you more money for the same income based on that energy efficiency? I've mentioned living in a neighborhood where I drive a quarter as much as other people do. That's almost $10,000 a year of savings. Did the bank recognize that $10,000 of affordability when I tried to qualify for a loan? Heck no. That's an impediment to builders building the kind of housing that the market wants, the kind of housing that particularly my kids' generation wants, which is walkable neighborhoods that are convenient to things, but which are too expensive for them right now. What's missing from the list? Energy price is relatively unimportant. In fact, it's of almost zero importance in encouraging efficiency. Surprising result, but it turns out to be the case when we do controlled experiments on this, which I'll show you the results of in a second. It can have second order effects. Higher energy prices make more things cost effective, thus regulations can be more stringent, but it's very indirect. You could, however, price energy services that I mentioned before. And why is that the case? Well, what would happen if you raised a carbon fee to about 100, maybe it was 150 a ton of carbon? We did that in California. We did it by accident. We did something that they call deregulation, which means that utilities don't have to plan for how much power they need. They'll simply buy power on the open market. And it produced immense power shortages. And in order to correct for them, we had to buy power at the opposite of fire sale prices. And electricity rates throughout the state went up 40% all at once and stayed that way for years into the future. So here's a graph I showed you before, electricity consumption in California. Look at that graph and tell me, what was the year in which energy price went up 40%? Because if you can't tell, it says there's practically no effect. The year, all right, I'll spoil it for you. The year was this one. That presaged an actual increase in consumption over the next 5 years. So that's why I think price doesn't really have much an effect. You've seen the same thing on a somewhat milder scale when gasoline prices went up to $4 and then back to $2. Yes, there was a small effect, but it was pretty darn small. So these policies all mutually enforce. There are those little arrows on the side of the pyramid. All of these policies will gradually introduce technology changes so that something might be expensive and only used by a few people to begin with, but it becomes cheaper and cheaper with production experience. So eventually the costs when you incorporate it into a standard can be as little as zero. For refrigerators, for example, we've reduced energy consumption over my advocacy career by 85%, and the inflation-adjusted price has dropped, not gone up. And even when standards kicked in at 30% savings, price didn't go up in those years. Voluntary programs and mandates, carrots and sticks, these reinforce each other. They're not either or. Everyone loves carrots instead of sticks until you get to the nasty question, who pays for the carrots? There's some things that are just such a good deal that you shouldn't have to pay people to do them. Individual choices are not the whole answer. This is something I gave at a presentation in person. So here are two things you can do. So I asked the question, how many of you did not use a car tonight? I'm trained by lawyers. I know you never ask a cross-examination question that you don't already know the answer to. Almost everyone drove their car tonight. And why? Because there weren't other good options for doing it. You can do an energy makeover of your house, but the infrastructure to support it isn't very widespread, and you run the risk of being taken to the cleaners, or at least being afraid that you will be. So it's a lot easier to do this when everyone else does. Here's the graph of refrigerators that I showed you, how the energy consumption went down so quickly, even though price went down. But the key point here is an individual could not make that 85% cut at any point in this graph. An individual could get 15% because that's all that was available on the market. So you need this combination of individuals responding to programs like Energy Star or managed incentives or market transformation to create markets in something that wouldn't otherwise be there. And you saw a similar thing with heating and cooling energy in California. You could do some of this on your own, couldn't do all of it on your own. Getting near the end of the time, so I will go over this quickly. Clean energy policy is economic development policy. This country went into a deep recession in 2007 to 9, from which half the country has yet to emerge. This is a key issue for the middle class. Median income and wealth performance has been terrible since then. And so these same problems are still with us, and energy efficiency policy can help with all of them. The mortgage meltdown, how's that related? This is a map of location efficiency. On the left, greener areas require fewer cars, and defaults at the height of the crisis on the right. These are the same map. People who lived in walkable, transit, bikeable neighborhoods defaulted at much, much lower rates. I'm talking about 20 times lower rates between this area and this one, both areas with lots of new housing construction. We still haven't solved that problem. One of the reasons that housing production is down so much is that the lending industry tightened up on the criteria that they understood, while not recognizing that people with the extra affordability that energy efficiency and solar and location efficiency in their houses give them. And so we're disqualifying all sorts of potential home buyers from the market. And this would be a way of solving the problem and getting the economy going on a broad state. How is the US doing? My experience is we're kind of middling among the countries of the year, where very strong action at the state and local level in some but not all large jurisdictions has compensated for relative inaction at the federal level, with the exception of 2009 to 17, where the federal government got really assertive about following the law as it's written on appliance efficiency standards and light bulb efficiency standards, and on setting fuel economy emission standards for not just cars, but trucks, including heavy-duty trucks. Those were major climate initiatives that were, in some cases, particularly trucks, initiated at the federal level. But by and large, even in the previous administration, a lot of the initiative has come from the state and local level and should continue to do so. These levels should not be, in my judgment, competitive, but rather should be trying to reinforce each other. Progress has been intermittent. You get better administrations, you get worse administrations at the federal level, at the state level. You get effective Republicans, you get ineffective Democrats. It's not entirely a partisan issue. I'm a California chauvinist, but there's no place that's really been exemplary. California screws up a lot of things as well, as recognized by the ACEEE ranking that does not place us as #1 state. Countries' successes help each other. So India was persuaded to realize that clean energy investment is a middle-class development policy, a poverty elimination policy, in part because they could look at us and China and the European Union, where we're doing that, and say, hey, yeah, that works for us too. So key takeaways from the evening. Climate change is a severe threat in the near future, which will do nothing but become worse. But it could become a whole lot worse, or it could become somewhat worse. And that's really the key choice we have to make. A whole lot worse is frightening enough that we don't even know what that means. It could be incredibly disastrous. But we can do more to stop it than most people think, including the most people who do the energy modeling for the IPCC or the International Energy Agency, because efficiency is typically undervalued by as many as 11 consistent biases in the analysis of what you can do with efficiency. And renewables have consistently been underpredicted by the US Energy Information Administration for the past 10 years. We have the real world expertise and experience to meet even the aspirational international goals. All we need is the political will. How do we change the political will? First, vote. Find out which candidates are supportive of this policy at the federal, state, local, regional level, and vote for them. And don't stop there. Once you have done that, write them on climate and clean energy issues, not once, but frequently. NRDC has a membership support unit that will help you with who needs to be written to, what's a format that you might want to write it in, who do you send it to. And so public comments can make a big difference, not just in legislation, but in regulatory proceedings, where we're starting to see tens of thousands of comments in on dockets that normally have far fewer than that. And the regulators will look at this. Write and speak on the issue in forums like the one we're in, with your friends, with your relatives. People have lots of opportunities for writing and public speaking to get the message out. And I'll conclude with the message, inspire hope. Hopefulness encourages us all, this is just human psychology, to do the best we possibly can. In contrast, hopelessness is a political tool that was used, for example, by the Nazis in World War II to try to discourage armed resistance and to try to make people despair of the liberation that eventually came in 1944 and 1945. So hope is amazingly powerful. That's how I want to end this talk. So I tried to save some time for Q&A. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Goldstein. I'm amazed at how much information we're able to cover, and still 5 minutes under what the allotted time that we had. There were definitely some questions that came up. I'm going to take kind of in order, and that maybe we can walk a little bit back into the presentation. The first question that we received was from Nancy Edwards. And I can ask it, which is, what is the biggest barrier to getting rapid energy retrofits in buildings and homes?
That's a really good question. And if you can see my face, you'll see that it's not an easy one to answer. Because we don't really have a prototype of a national program at the scale we need anywhere in the world. I think what I would do is look at trying to establish legislative programs that look as if they are duplicative on the surface. I would look at grants from DOE and EPA separately in competition with each other to state energy offices, utilities, local agencies, to try to test drive various good ideas for how you would do retrofits, and to set some at least guidance standards on what a deep retrofit means. In my mind, it means savings in your total utility bills of 30 to 50%. So it's pretty ambitious. It would probably cost, it'll vary a lot from house to house, but call it $30,000, $20,000 a house. Big deal effort. I would try to integrate it with improving health and safety so you don't have mold problems, so you have adequate ventilation, so you have filtration. So if you get this particulate matter that I showed you in my second slide, you can turn on a special forest fire switch and breathe healthy air in your house. We have done experiments on a community scale for retrofits in which an administrator, in this case utilities, did all the work. They marketed the program, they went to everyone's house, they said, we'd like you to let an energy rater into your house to see what's the story there, to get a scope of work for a retrofit. We'll hire a contractor to come to your house and do it. We'll hire an inspector to make sure they've done it right. We'll pay for it all and you never have to pay anything back. That's a pretty good deal. You'd be nuts to say no to that, and nobody did. But since most of the benefits accrue to you through better comfort, better health, better safety, lower utility bills, why should we spend government money on that? Why shouldn't we just make sure there's financing available to you and maybe subsidize it a little bit to prime the pump? So to me, that's the first thing I would try to get going. Again, getting banks to consider energy efficiency savings and solar savings as an offset to mortgage payments is a first step. And this has been a bipartisan bill for a number of years that has been held up, apparently because the National Association of Realtors has opposed it for reasons that don't make any sense when you try to think it through. But it's clearly a win-win. So that's what I would suggest. EPA and DOE have been a little mutually competitive on this issue, and I think we can harness that by saying, okay, you don't have to try the same programs. Let's try both, and let's do evaluations and see which ones are working better in terms of more savings for lower cost and reductions in costs or improvement in savings year upon year because of learning curve as you go do this. So that's the start. I would encourage you all to think about it and get back to me or each other with any good ideas you have.
We'll let you know if we can convince a little bit of Austin Energy to help us do that too, and then use a little bit of support from the knowledge out there by EPA and by the DOE, so like how we can get a little bit more efficient on residential and commercial.
Yeah, there's one other thing I would add on that, and that is we're trying to establish markets in energy efficiency. In order to establish markets, you have to establish value, because a retrofit isn't a thing. When I go to sell my house and I say it was retrofit, the buyers aren't going to care. What you need is an energy rating, a HERS rating, at the end of the program, saying my house has a projected energy use of $1,000 a year, and it has a HERS rating of 66. And therefore, you can use that when you are listing your house and compare with other properties and get a better price for it. So what you're doing with the rating is you're moving people out of the world where they're looking at payback and into the world where they're looking at property values upon resale.
Matt,
I'd like to just hop in there and just give Austin Energy its due. We have the Austin Energy Green Building Program, which is one of the oldest efficiency programs in the country, and it's been remarkably effective. And we do something similar to that in terms of forcing audits of homes so that that information is available to buyers and sellers at transition. And so Austin Energy is actually in the bottom 10% of total bills in the state of Texas as a consequence of that program. And so our billing structure is such that we have to make up for that in higher rates, right? So we're right at the average within the state for energy costs per unit, kilowatt hour, but we're in the bottom 10% for total bills. So Austin Energy has a lot to be proud of in this area, which is why, given opportunity, I'll come back with a couple of questions about what we could do better still. But we should, as a city, we should have the ambition to be the exemplar city for Texas, and I think we can be very, very easily because we're partway there.
Thank you, and thank you for providing the local color, because that's really why I was emphasizing local and state initiative throughout the talk.
Yeah, it was a wonderful wealth of information you provided there.
So while we're on the subject of Austin, I think the second question we received was from Carol. And so Carolyn, I'm sorry. She mentioned that most of Austin's forest is on private property. And she's wondering, from your perspective, Dr. Goldstein, if it is better carbon reduction wise to save the big trees, that are kind of on private property of urban landscape, or to cut them down and build more densely.
Okay, that wasn't the question I expected. I don't really know for two reasons. One, NRDC has someone who's expert on carbon sequestration in existing and new forests, and I'm not that person. His name is Peter Miller, pmiller@nrdc.org. You can ask him about that piece. Greater density, I don't think is a trade-off with forests, because the whole point of density is you're getting more people within the same space. So if Austin undertakes policies to increase density, you are creating more space, and you don't have to do it by destroying forests. You can do it by, replacing parking lots, or, there are a lot of wonderful examples where you had a street that's not interesting, that's not fun to walk on, particularly during Texas summers. And you create commercial interest by putting the parking underground and building higher density above the parking. So you've got just as much or more parking as you had before, but you have a lot more commercial interest, a lot more residential interest, and neighborhoods that people just are happier to live in. So I guess my answer is I would hope that that's a false choice.
But thanks for providing that context. And that was pmiller@nrdc.org, right?
pmiller@nrdc.org.
Great. Yeah, I think that's an issue of conservation versus development that we're dealing with, and that could be a useful resource. So another question that we received was from Matt, who is third, and then Scott Ewan asked the question, and Stan. So Matt, if you want to ask your question, and then Scott can be after that, and then Stan can follow.
Okay, well, thank you. I guess it's just the local context, just because I want to acknowledge what Juan has done in creating kind of a series of conversations. And then we had Zach Balmer, who's the City of Boston Climate Program Manager, come and speak about an ongoing, in the moment activity, which is an update to our climate equity plan, which is kind of a 5-year review of our ambitions with respect to climate protection. And it's pretty ambitious. So this is for everyone attending, as well as our speaker. We had the City of Boston adopted a 2050 citywide carbon neutral goal. And as part of this review, this document's been published for public review and is going to be coming up to council soon. It's, I think, a good and ambitious document, and the goal is being revised, and that essentially says we need to be more ambitious still, we need to be faster still. So we are upping our ante and trying to be a carbon neutral city by 2040. Austin Energy as utility is great. It's arguably on track and will be carbon neutral as far as city electricity goes by 2035. Transportation is the tough nut to crack, but we have a bond issue up in November, an $8 billion bond, with the largest bond that the city's ever tried to digest to address that issue, this fault in planning that is kind of at the heart of the community. And it's not perfect, you know, but again, I'll harken back to we can't let good be the enemy of, can't let perfect be the enemy of good. And so now I have two questions or comments, I guess. One is markets. I'd like to kind of see how you might compare the experience in the California recently with its energy shortfalls versus Texas, because markets have proven very effective in Texas. And I think part of it is because we have a very simplified regulatory structure. And so we're benefiting, the state of Texas is benefiting by going second. California went first. We're benefiting by going second. We have a so we've risen very rapidly in our renewable adoption. And then the city has taken advantage of that functional market with a very direct pricing effort. And in 1 year, we're going to reduce our emissions by 20%. I serve on the Electric Utility Commission. I take personal pride in this little thing. But that's something that we have done. And I feel like there's lots of opportunity to leverage that further still. We're far from exhausting the potential of markets, because I would argue that we haven't yet tried to employ them. And then my question is, I really liked what you said about banking and building efficient homes, and how that's something that's not valued. And we're in a moment where I think the city has a big appetite to try to do everything it can. And that struck me as a very novel and interesting thing. I was just wondering if you had anything to point to where a municipality had success in pushing the banking and the finance community to finance more generously the things we want and need more of.
Well, I'll answer them in reverse order.
Thank you.
I'm not aware of a city that has taken that initiative, and I think Austin would be a very good place to try to do it, because I know there's generally a good relationship in most cities between the political leadership and the business community leadership. And this is a measure, including energy and location efficiency and lending criteria, is a business development measure, because it makes it easier for recruits that are trying to get to your city from elsewhere to afford a home, and to afford the type of home that they would prefer to live in. So if we had, I can imagine if you had the mayor and maybe other members of the business community talk to the CEO of a locally based bank and say, hey, we would like you to do this, not just because you'll make more money doing it, but because this is good for our community, you might get an answer of yes. This is something that, I don't want to go too far down the rabbit hole, but mortgage lending is regulated by informal regulations drawn up by Fannie Mae that no one even thinks of as regulation. So when you talk about market forces versus government regulation, no one ever thinks about the Fannie Mae regulations that affect people's personal lives far more deeply and negatively than a lot of the regulations you hear anti-regulatory people talking about. But you don't have to follow Fannie Mae rules unless you want to sell your mortgages on the secondary market to Fannie Mae. Many banks will retain a significant fraction of their mortgages themselves, and thus they can do whatever they want. They could unilaterally make rules on energy efficiency and location efficiency on their own mortgages and be done with it. And incidentally, they would produce data in terms of loan performance over the years that I'm utterly confident would show that these loans outperform the conventional loans. So it's a double or triple win-win for the bank, because they've got new customers they wouldn't have ordinarily had, at higher loan amounts than they would have ordinarily written, with a lower default rate than they normally would have had, and with better cost recovery if they do have to foreclose and resell than they would have otherwise had. So I would be happy to work with you on trying to make that outreach work.
That's actually a marvelous answer. I really like that answer. I think we're at a junction in time where there'd be a lot of receptivity to proposing ideas like that, and just saying, hey, you know, what do we need to do as a city to make you banks move 10% of your portfolio over to this area, with the intention of creating housing stock that integrates well with this big transportation effort that we're going into, and increasing density, and, you know, just aligning all the objectives that we're kind of outlining, because, you know, we're beginning to recognize more universally that we need to. So that's a great answer. Thank you.
So on your first question, I'm not going to comment on the Texas market because I don't know enough to say something intelligent on it. In California, the blackouts of a couple of weeks ago were greatly exaggerated, in my personal opinion, as to their importance. I did read the report from the state regulators on the subject, and basically the problem was unprecedented weather that's attributable to climate change. That you had gotten that kind of heat wave in California before, but you didn't have it under circumstances that the Southwest and the Northwest also had heat waves, and therefore didn't have spare power to send to us. It also had to do with a couple of forced outages at gas-fired power plants. And thirdly, it had to do with the resource planning process not adequately taking into account not just climate change, but the integration of renewable energy into the grid. So they had not issued procurement guidelines for sufficient amounts of power to cover this kind of thing with the safety margin for forced outages in advance. And so they claim that that's what they will be doing in their next resource adequacy proceedings over the next year.
I agree with your assessment wholeheartedly, and I would point to a lot of our own near outage incidents. Most of them have been weather forced, and they've been typically really revealing the vulnerabilities of existing fossil fuel facilities that have been the critical 1/3 contributors to overlapping risks that created the stress event. So thank you.
Yeah, the real power problems we've had in California are public safety power shutoffs that are required to prevent the risk of utilities starting fires, and those affect far more people at far more economic and comfort damage. And you know, those are a lot harder nut to crack, because it's not a question of resource adequacy, it's a question of lots and lots of different issues that have to be addressed better.
Yeah, well, there's several of us on the Utility Commission. They're actually, you know, we can see the trend in climate change, and that's going to create a significant trend in flood and fire risk both here in Central Texas. I think the Austin area is actually ranked 5th in the nation as a fire risk area. And so, you know, it's something that's on our minds. What the ultimate right solution is not as clear, but we sympathize with your having gone first to demonstrate the challenges, but appreciate your efforts.
Thank you.
Yeah, so I'm sure that there could be a good conversation there between David and Matt that can last a couple of hours. But knowing that we're nearing the end of time, I'm going to flip a little bit of the questions between Stan, and then I'll ask Scott, because it's a little bit of a faster response maybe. So Stan Pipkin is asking, Dr. Goldstein, if you had a single message or policy directive to announce tomorrow that would have the highest impact at mobilizing all the stakeholders, apart from voting, what would it be?
To make this a priority issue when you communicate with business leaders and political leaders. Climate is usually, in my experience, number 4 on a people's list of their top 3 priorities. And that's why doesn't get acted on, coupled with disinformation by a number of people, particularly with financial interests, who will suggest that clean energy is a bad investment, or that you're going to have to make sacrifices or deep compromises in order to get to goals. So I think the attitude of hope, saying, no, we know how to do this. We have the IEA reports every year. We have the IPCC report in 2018 saying, we know how to solve this. And financially, it's within the capability of the world and basically the private sector.
Thanks, David. Maybe just a quick follow-up. I appreciate that. I was wondering, I was going to ask just as a second part of the question, what role do you see the cultural institutions, so call it, mobilizing the zeitgeist in a very clarifying way to, deliver that message? I mean, I think most of what you've surveyed are, different policy and programmatic strategies and kind of the ecosystemic effects of those working together. But do you see a strong role for that? And I know it certainly has changed in the last 10 years, and we had moments in the last 30 years, but where do you see the efficacy of that kind of activity?
Well, I think it's really important. People are social animals, and people will respond generally by going along to things that they hear repeatedly. So the business community, the religious community, I mean, when we heard the Pope a couple of years ago talk about the importance of stopping climate change, I think that was a very constructive message, and that's not the only religion that's done stuff like this. So civic organizations, big and small businesses, governments at all level, other NGOs, maybe ones not directly concerned primarily with climate, but climate is a social justice issue. If you have an organization that is looking out for the interests of poorer people are bearing the brunt of the impacts of climate change. And if you just get this on their agenda, and a lot of them already have it, it doesn't even have to be issue number one. It just has to be something where they say, yeah, we need to do something about that.
Great, thanks.
Thank you. And then there's two more questions. One is from Scott Nguyen, who is asking a little bit about the social and economic ramifications of the transportation pricing plans that you had mentioned. So such as different methods that you mentioned in our presentation to control congestion.
Yeah, that's a good question that comes up in the political discussion quite a bit. Our research suggests that the amount people drive is pretty much proportional to income up to median or a little higher levels, controlling for everything else. So to first order, there are positive equity impacts of congestion pricing, particularly if you do it the way they did it in the cities that have done it, which is Singapore, Stockholm, and London, where the money is used to provide alternative transportation services to people who would otherwise have driven. So London implemented a border crossing fee of, I think, £5, maybe went up to 8, and put all the money in improving the underground and the bus system. And so it met with pretty good political acceptance from conservatives to liberals because the benefits of it were clear. I mean, a pure fee without recycling the money somehow is a complete non-starter politically and probably should be. But if you use the money in a targeted way to create greater fairness in the transportation system, I think you'll be able to support it. I mean, what people tend to forget is that only about half the population is legally or physically capable of driving.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can now. You've faded out for a bit.
Sorry, I don't know, but I got logged out.
Great.
But so I've lost the questions, but I think Daryl can still have the rest of the chat. I think I'm sorry I didn't hear the response, but I think Kaiba had one more question, and I think that of course we can continue the conversation if we're able to, but we can ask Kaiba's question and others that come along.
Mm-hmm. Kaiba, I have your question here. Would you like to ask it yourself?
Oh, sure. Yeah, I'm just wondering if you can speak to this, what solutions you see for the petrochemical and plastics industry. You know, that is now a significant driver of oil and gas extraction, including here in Texas. And, you know, it seems like the industry is, you know, they're doing that intentionally as other, you know, kind of sources of demand for electricity production and even transportation are waning. And yeah, just wondering if you can speak to how we can address that sector.
Well, I think there's a multi-pronged approach. The first prong is encouraging those businesses to be more proactive on investments in clean energy in their own facilities. One major company, for example, a couple of years ago, announced a major, like $500 million-ish investment in upgrading the emissions and energy performance of their facilities. And I talked to their energy manager, and he said the return on investment was 40%. So there are a lot of unexploited opportunities for reducing emissions in that industry. So that's a starting point. A second point, which they won't want to hear but need to hear, is that there isn't a future in a climate sensitive scenario that I can see, unless we're way more successful with carbon capture and storage, and I think we're going to be, for an industry anywhere near that size. And therefore, if you are faced with the inevitability of being a fraction of yourself within my lifetime, the first thing you do is stop throwing money down the rat hole. You stop creating stranded investments by investing in things with 20-year lifetimes. And they don't want to hear that, but they would rather stop throwing money down the rat hole now than they would 5 years from now when the inevitability catches up with them. Now, that doesn't mean the industry disappears, because we're probably still going to have a plastics industry, a chemicals industry. So oil will still be used, but it can't be used for nearly the volume that the industry has been used to over its history.
And just a quick follow-up, what do you see as what would be an effective federal policy directed at that industry?
Well, the first thing that I've proposed is a financial incentive for strategic energy management, which basically says, we'd like you to set your own goal for 9 years from now about how much your energy performance is going to improve. And we're going to pay you upfront in tax incentives for the cumulative value over 9 years of all the savings that you commit to producing. And then we'll claw it all back if you don't meet your goal. What this does is it gives industry a chance to look at something in other terms than 2-year payback or 18-month payback. It's going to say, let's set a 9-year goal, let's achieve the 9-year goal. The clawbacks are necessary just to assure honesty, but you know, think about it. If you were the manager of the plant and it's 7 years from now and you're falling short of your 9-year goal, you would say, well, I'm not going to give that money back to the government. I'm going to accelerate some new kind of investment. I'm going to put more solar in if I can't think of anything more creative than that. I'm going to do something to meet my goal. So you will get the goal. Because right now, the evaluations of strategic energy management have shown that it's really good at getting the low-hanging fruit picked, but there's no evidence that it's supporting 6-year paybacks, which is what industry in most of our competitor countries regularly invest in with respect to clean energy. And then there are like I said, there's no silver bullet. There's a lot of these other policies, but that's the one thing.
Well, I think we've ran a little bit past the allotted time that we had, and I know that we can continue to have a much more engaging conversation. I want to be respectful and be super thankful of the time you've taken out of your day, Dr. Goldstein, to explain to us a little bit more about what it needs to have a comprehensive energy policy for a cleaner energy future. It is definitely not a simple answer, and we can look at it from many different lenses and many different actions we can take. I invite everyone to reach out to you at your email, dgoldstein@nrdc.org, for any other questions or recommendations. I'll be writing up a little bit of something that way we can summarize your talk and make sure that these solutions or these different examples that you presented are available to the public. So for those of us that weren't able to make it, as well as the recording that will be available on YouTube. So I don't know if anyone else has other questions, but I really want to thank you for the time that you've taken. It has been a phenomenal presentation. As Nancy mentioned, we really have learned a lot and have a lot more to do now and inspire hope among our community. So thank you.
Well, thank you. This has been a great audience, even through the flawed medium of Zoom, in terms of the engagement that you've all had. So thank you.
Well, thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Goldstein.
Good evening.
Have a great evening, everyone. And we'll stay in touch for November happy hour.
All right, thank
Take
you,
care.
Juan. Good job, Juan.
Thanks for your time.
Absolutely.